Chapter 9. A New Rumor. Half asleep, Yuki heard the sounds of waking all around her and knew it was 6:30. The head counter was making his rounds, pounding at each stall door until someone answered with the number of people inside. "It's a stupid idea," Ken remarked when the head count began. "No one's going to try to escape." Yuki thought he was right. It did seem silly. After all, how far could anyone with a Japanese face get on the outside? Still, it was an order from someone, somewhere, and each morning they were roused at 6:30 and had to be back in their stall for another head count at 6:30 in the evening as well. Since Ken slept closest to the door, it was his job to answer 3 whenever the head counter came. This morning, Yuki was wide awake, ready to call out the head counter if Ken was still asleep. Now that schools had opened, Yuki had to get up early. Even so, it was usually Emmy who called to her first over the partition. "Are you ready, Yuki?" she would shout. And Yuki would answer, "In a minute, Emmy. Give me one more minute." It was a good thing. It took only 5 minutes to walk to school. Most classes were doubled up in barracks that were meant to be mess halls. The high school met in the grandstand by the perimutal windows. Supplies were short, and Nisei teachers were still being recruited from among the evacuees. In spite of that, Yuki was glad to be back in school, for she was getting bored, drifting about aimlessly all day. She liked her young Nisei teacher, and after a while, she got used to the strangeness of being in a school where all the pupils were Japanese. She had wakened early this morning after a dream that Ken was gone. The good dreams about home vanished like smoke in a night sky, but the bad dreams seemed to linger on, hovering over her early waking hours like a reluctant vulture. Yuki shuddered and tried to brush away the loneliness left by the dream. Ever since the night of the party, she wanted to ask Ken whether he had applied for a scholarship, but he didn't seem to want to discuss it with her. Now, Yuki was afraid everything was already settled and that he had made up his mind to go. "Grandfather will look after you," Annie said, trying to console Yuki. But Yuki wasn't sure she wanted to be looked after by Mr. Kurihara. He might even try to talk Mother into going back to Japan someday. "We have many friends in the camp," Mother reminded her, "and besides, Father may be home one of these days." He had written that there would soon be hearings for all the men, and that his Caucasian friends had written many different affidavits of support for him. Mother seemed pleased about Ken's efforts to leave camp. "We must think of his future," she explained. "We want him to be a fine doctor someday." Still, Yuki didn't want him to go. The more she thought of it, the sadder she felt. It didn't help matters when she came home from school and saw the college catalogs that had come in from the mail for Ken. Mother saw Yuki's glum face and knew what was troubling her. "Come help me weed our little garden," she urged. Like many of their neighbors, Mother had sent out for some flower seeds and planted them in a small patch of ground in front of their stall. The summer sun and manure-rich soil had produced a beautiful crop of stalks, petunias, and zinnias that brightened the patch of earth around them. Mother said she would rather have flowers to look at than laundered clothes, and she didn't have clotheslines put up in front of their stall as many of the people had done. Even digging the soil with the sun warm on her back and the bright zinnias blinking at her didn't seem to help. It wasn't just feeling lonely. It was the thought that Ken was deserting them that bothered Yuki most. Ken was not only letting her down, he was breaking his promise to Father. "Phooey. Double phooey," Yuki murmured, and leaving Mother to finish weeding, she decided to go to the canteen. Yuki didn't even bother asking Emmy to go with her. She simply ran down the track, squinting at the dust and wind, and hurried to the canteen. It was crowded as usual, and Yuki took her place in line, counting to see how many tickets there were in the $2.50 script book that was issued to each adult for the month. Mother had to wait in line for 2 hours to get her script. When Yuki finally got to the counter, the only items left were black and brown shoelaces. "Just what I wanted," she said glumly. She had missed out on the last of the ice cream. Suddenly, she felt a light tap on her shoulder. "Why do you look so sad, little one? Do you have your heart set on some ice cream?" It was Mr. Toda, who had been in line behind her. Yuki shook her head. "Who cares about ice cream?" she mumbled. "Ah, then it's something else, is it?" Yuki wasn't going to say anything, but the concerned look on Mr. Toda's face made her want to tell him everything. She soon found herself telling him about Ken and his plan to leave for school. Mr. Toda listened thoughtfully, nodding. and rubbing his chin. Ah, yes, he said slowly. It is too bad. Life must be filled with such difficult choices. Why must we choose between Japan and America? I love them both. I belong to both. He spoke as though he were still arguing with a bald headed man and seemed almost to be talking to himself. It's too bad Ken must choose between his responsibility to you and finishing school. He added, It's a hard choice. Yuki shook her head. I don't think it's so hard, she said. He should just decide to stay here. The old man looked hard at Yuki and put a hand on her cheek. Let him go, Yuki-chan, he said softly. Your mother is right. You know that, don't you? And then, patting her shoulders, he left for the bachelor's quarters while Yuki turned toward Barrack 16. Deep in her heart, Yuki knew that both Mother and Mr. Toto were right. She knew she should be glad for Ken, but somehow she just couldn't make herself tell him so. Besides, he was rarely home these days, and he often ate his meals at other mess halls with his friends. In the evening, he would go out to play ball, or go to the town hall discussion group or a recorded concert with Jim and the boys. And on Saturdays, he usually got dressed up and took a girl to the dance at the grandstand. Even when there were old movies at the recreation hall, he wouldn't go with Yuki and Emmy, but went with his own friends. Maybe Ken was already a lost cause, Yuki thought, whether he stayed or not. It was one afternoon, in the showers, that Yuki first heard the rumor that they would soon be sent to another inland camp. She and Emmy had gone together, and not discovered till they were half through the showering that they had both forgotten to bring their bath towels. Oh, Emmy wailed. How will we get dry? One of us can go back for towels, Yuki suggested. Loser gets dressed. John can pull. Wet and dripping, they clenched fists and shook 3 times. Emmy thrust out flat palm for paper, and Yuki thrust out 2 fingers for scissors. Scissors cut paper, I win, Yuki shouted. Shrieking with laughter and dismay, Emmy pulled her dress over her dampness and ran in her zoris to fetch their towels. It was while Yuki waited that she heard 2 high school girls talking about the new rumor. Here we're moving in September, one called to the other. Where to? Utah or Idaho? Ugh, how awful. You sure? Everybody was talking about it in math today. When Emmy got back, Yuki quickly told her what she had heard and then offered to wait while Emmy took another shower and dried herself properly. But Emmy wasn't about to waste her time on a second shower. Let's go find out if it's true, she said eagerly. Grandma will know. She knows all about every rumor in camp. When Emmy and Yuki rushed back to tell her, however, Emmy's grandmother scarcely looked up from the sweater she was knitting to enter in the camp hobby show. Oh, I've heard that rumor for days now, she said calmly, but I don't believe it's going to happen for a long time. When Ken came home for the 6:30 head count, he said everyone at the hospital was talking about the same rumor. They say it'll happen within a month, he said soberly. And then, after a brief silence, he spoke again. Well, I guess that settles it, he said. I'm not going out to college, at least not yet. But Kenichi, Mother objected, we have friends here. We'll all be moving together. You needn't worry about Yuki and me. Ken had made up his mind, however, with the same determination that Mother often displayed. I'm not leaving you two to pack up and leave here by yourselves, he said flatly. Jim's decided he should stay and help his family too. Besides, he added with a grin, who else would carry that enormous rucksack of ours but me? Yuki wanted to rush over and give Ken an enormous hug, but she knew he would hate such a display of affection. Yahoo! She shouted happily, and she didn't care how far down the stable anyone heard. Ken's not leaving. Ken's going to stay. Hooray! Emmy shouted from her stall, and she came rushing over to celebrate with Yuki. Thank you, Kenichi, Mother said. Although she said nothing more, she looked relieved and happy. Yuki simply had to do something nice for Ken. She went to her shelf and got out a chocolate bar for Mimi that she'd been saving for herself. She was tempted to break it in half and go halves with Ken, but in a burst of generosity, she gave him the whole bar. Here, she said, thrusting it in his hands. You can have it. It's got almonds in it. Ken knew what Yuki was trying to tell him. Thanks, he said simply, and grinning, he gave her a friendly poke in the ribs.